Welcome, guys. This is more Script Camp. We are here today with writing fantasy TV shows. And this is actually the first time we have done this topic. We've never done this one before partially because fantasy TV is such a sort of hard to pin down thing. Like, it's sort of almost entirely oriented around these big adaptations and huge IP and stuff like this. So writing fantasy TV shows is not always something that people who are breaking into screenwriting, like, it doesn't always make the most sense for them to do, because it's like, we should pick a show that's more likely to be made, or things like that. You can always write these things as writing samples. Like, you can let your imagination run wild, and you can write the craziest things you want. The thing is, if you want to be writing on this kind of show, your samples should pretty much reflect that. You should have fantasy stuff in your portfolio. So, of course, even though we are incentivized in some ways to be writing things that are more likely to be made, if you want to write fantasy, you gotta write fantasy. It's as simple as that. Let's get into it. So, we're on Script Camp, which is part of our larger Skill Camp group of servers. That includes Word Camp, which is novel writing focused, Film Camp for filmmaking, Creator Camp is focused on content creation, Toon Camp for animation, AI Camp, Lingo Camp, Design Camp, Code Camp, Game Camp for game design. These are all of our many servers in the Skill Camp family, with lots of free classes, table reads, script swaps, and writers groups to help you reach your life goals. We have some classes that are open to everybody, like this one here, and lots of completely open writing and genre groups, writers groups, swaps, readings, and events like that. And then we have some that are for our supporting members. So supporting members get access to things like the boot camps, which take you all the way from idea to finished draft of your script in just a matter of weeks. 6 weeks for TV, 8 weeks for feature, 12 weeks for the novel. And you also get access to things like Writers Labs, where you can bring questions and topics that you're working on or chewing on, and you can get feedback on your work up to 5 pages at a time. And there are 2 of those a week, so plenty of chances to get feedback, to ask your questions, and to get that boost forward that you need. You can sign up at scriptcamp.net, get access to unlimited membership, which includes every class, every server, every workshop, every group. Or you can get just a single course on its own if you want to at scriptcamp.net/classes, but we recommend you sign up for that unlimited membership, which is as low as just $19 a month if you're subscribing for our yearly option. We'll have a poll in the chat that you can vote yes if you're interested in signing up, or you can indicate if you have other questions or some issue or some concern, something like that. We will help you out as best we can. So, most people here know me already. I'm Connor, teach the TV, feature, and novel classes. And I am mostly a horror thriller writer, but within the world of books especially, I am primarily a fantasy writer. So most of my ideas are in the sci-fi, fantasy, and horror type of space. And as we know, horror itself involves a lot of fantastical elements here and there. And similar themes, rules, constraints, and elements go into building horror and fantasy. They share a lot of the same DNA. So obviously there's a lot of crossover between these different things. Thriller as well will also, supernatural thrillers and things like this will also involve fantasy elements. And we'll go into a little bit more of that breakdown of how to delineate between those two genres, or the many different variations of fantasy today. So, let's get started. I'm not going to read this whole long quote, but I think that the first thing that we would want to look at is this question of originality versus adaptation. Here's the overview of today's class. So we'll start with that. We'll go into practical steps and story engines, traditions, styles, and subgenres, world building, magic, and different species. And we will finish up with picture prompts. These are pictures that we show that you can come up with an idea for a fantasy TV show based around that picture or inspired by that picture on the spot. And then the rest of the group can throw you some curveballs, like let's reimagine it in a slightly different subgenre or something like this. It's fun to just take the first thing that comes to your head and then adjust and modify it based on variables that lead to new creative avenues. Let's get going. So, to begin with, maybe we often start with this question, just what are some of your favorite fantasy shows? What makes a good fantasy show, and why? What do you guys like? What would you like to see more of? What do you think needs a comeback or needs an adaptation? This would be a fine spot to just speak up and tell us what are some of your favorite shows and why. Maybe I'll get started and then I can call on folks, or you can speak up in the chat. You can use the text chat by clicking on the white word bubble that is on the Classroom channel, and it says Open Chat. You can use that text, or if you're watching on Twitter, YouTube, Twitch, or one of our other sites, we can usually see your comments. It just takes like a few extra minutes for them to show up sometimes. But in any case, I'll get started. So for me, I I started with a lot of fantasy shows as a kid. A lot of my favorite shows had heavy fantasy elements in them. Things like Samurai Jack or Powerpuff Girls or things like this. Like many cartoons feature fantastical tropes all the time. There's less of a divide between reality and fantasy when you're a kid, and so we see kid-focused media, I think, featuring a lot of magical stuff. And that extended into my interest in things like Dungeons & Dragons from a very young age. And I was, to the extent that I was even a pro game master as my main job for a couple years here, my first 2 years here in LA. And a delivery driver, but I guess between those two. And so some of my favorites were also things like Adventure Time, Pushing Daisies. I really like the sort of concrete rules of Pushing Daisies and the way that that leads to dramatic and interesting situations. And also just the amount of plot that they're able to cover in any individual episode. It was always kind of astounding how we have sometimes several different interlinked mysteries, all that are tied together by the same investigator, looking into them and connecting them and finding out that they're, in fact, more connected than we thought. It almost has that kind of neo-noir crime-solving element to it, but in this very whimsical, fantastical world with people coming back to life from the dead and all these kind of wonderful Tim Burton-esque things going on. So those are a couple of my favorite fantasy shows and why. I think, we love fantasy TV because it allows us to dive very deeply into exploring a different worlds. That's a huge draw of fantasy TV, so we like to see, as a kid, some of my other favorite shows were things like Lost and Battlestar Galactica, which both also are primarily sci-fi, but feature fantasy elements and feature a really dense, interesting world. Sometimes with different species or different classifications of humans or things like this, which we can kind of explore in greater depth due to the fact that we have so much more time on TV. That's just one of the great strengths of TV in general, just the amount of time that you get. Okay, what are some of your guys' favorite fantasy shows and why? What do you think makes a great fantasy show?
I'm scared to say because my favourite one is quite controversial.
Say it. Be brave.
I absolutely love Rings of Power.
Great, okay.
There you go. I said it. I love Rings of Power.
I've only seen the pilot, but I love Lord of the Rings. Tell us about it. Why do you love it? What does it do right? What's working?
I mean, there's a lot that I can agree with fans that don't work, but for me, I just love there's host characters, obviously. I love the fact that I don't want to give too much away for people who haven't seen it, but I love the fact that the character that we've known from the Lord of the Rings books, we know is so horrific and, such a pure evil. And this one kind of, especially in the second season, is like almost sympathetic. Like, I like him. Like, it's so weird. It's like, I enjoy it. It's a wholesome fantasy. I'm not really into like the likes of Lord of the Rings that are all like gruesome gore, death and sex. To me, I like the real wholesome, like there's danger, there's threats, there's fighting evil, but it's kind of about companionship and family and getting to know you and that kind of stuff. So
I see. So you mean like themes that are rooted in like the softer side of humanity, where like love and compassion and things like this will always win the day, which is very much like at the root of Lord of the Rings. It's like the common courage of average people standing up against evil and things like this, as opposed to some other shows like Game of Thrones, which are kind of like, no, the most ruthless one just wins.
Yeah, exactly. I like the idea that no matter how bad things, no matter how much dark times you live in, ultimately at the end, you know that good wins.
Right, yes.
The question is how. So it's a comfort in that.
I totally get it. Thank you for that. I'm seeing in the chat we have some other suggestions. Luke says Penny Dreadful, Berserk, Twilight Zone, Castlevania. So we've got some anime in there, got some anthologies in there. Awesome. Somebody else, feel free to speak up.
I like the urban fantasies.
Great. All right. Like which one?
So, A Discovery of Witches, True Blood, any of the Harry Potters, Buffy the Vampire Slayer, all those things that give us, a secondary world happening within conjunction of our own world, I think are always a lot of fun. I mean, I do like the epic stuff. I like Game of Thrones. that was just super well done. I'm also a D&D player, so there you have it. But that being said, I really love urban fantasy. I love the paranormal stuff. I'm where the fantasy and paranormal stuff kind of border one on the other. Even something that's a police procedural like Lucifer with a fantastical element appeals.
Right. I plugged it too much during the horror TV class, but check out 30 Coins on HBO if you're into urban fantasy, kind of like cosmic horror type of stuff.
30 coins, you said?
That's right.
Yeah. You said 30 coins?
Yes. Check it
All
out.
right, I'm going to check that out.
Yeah, for sure. It's on HBO Max if you have that one. In the US, at least. I don't know about other countries. Thank you for weighing in, everybody. I'm seeing in the chat also, even more from Luke, Dead Like Me, and Wednesday, Legend of the Seeker. Thank you guys for all these great suggestions of shows. Let's go ahead into this question of original versus adaptation. So most of the ones that we just listed now, most of these properties are adaptations because adaptations dominate the fantasy and sci-fi speculative TV and film kind of world. Why? Because they're super expensive. And in order to get something like that off the ground, usually producers and people on that side like to have this understanding that it will make its money back. And in order to make its money back, it's got to be hugely popular. And in order to be hugely popular, it would really help if it had a built-in fan base. And there are just lots of things to choose from, so why would they pick something original when they have so many sure bets that are just lying in trunks and chests all over the world? Things that have never actually been adapted yet. There's plenty of IP for them to draw from, and it's just not adapted as much as other IP. So there's plenty of IP out there. In any case, most shows are adapted. Mostly from books, nowadays from video games, comic books, and everything else. All the biggest ones are Rings of Power, Game of Thrones, The Witcher, His Dark Materials, Dead Boy Detectives, Agatha All Along, Constantine are all adapted from comic books or novels. And then we have, on the video game side, things like Castlevania as well. So we have lots of different sources to draw from. In terms of originals, they exist, but they're pretty rare. I named just 3 original fantasy shows. I think 2 of these are off the air. I think Chaos is still on, but in any case, I'm just trying to think in the past few years, what have been some original fantasy shows on the air? Chaos on Netflix, in which we sort of interpret the Greek gods as modern-day figures. Not terribly unsimilar from something like American Gods, but more like from the gods' POV. Carnival Row, which is on Amazon, and that is sort of a Victorian-adjacent kind of world, but gaslamp fantasy where we have fairies and witches and vampires and things like that all coexisting together. And then we have Disenchantment, which was a sort of a pastiche parody-type cartoon of high fantasy media, but in any case, it was an original franchise. That was on Netflix from, I think, 2018 to 2022 or 23. So you might want to think, if I'm trying to get a show actually off the ground as opposed to just writing one for the fun of it, you might look at public domain properties or story spaces that make great fantasy shows. Let's think, for instance, of some story space that would work really well. Mythology, I think we've seen again and again, drawn from, I mentioned that show Chaos. There was another, I think, was it called Blood of Hades or Blood of Zeus on Netflix, which was sort of an anime interpretation of mythology as well. We've got a new God of War show based on the video game in development now for the 3rd time with the 3rd different showrunner, I think. But in any case, you can see how that's drawing from, again, the world of mythology or biblical, the sort of biblical spaces. These make for great places to adapt. And it's open and available to everyone. So it still feels like it has that name recognition to it. Or think also in things along the lines of stuff like, Arthurian legend, fairy tales like Grimm, or what was it called? Tell Me a Story. Shows like this that are drawing from things in the public consciousness, or what's it called? Ghost stories or urban legends or things like this also make good story space for IP. What do you guys think? What are some good story spaces that haven't been adapted as much?
Can I ask a question about that with the original stuff?
Sure.
Would you say it's... I'm thinking about original stuff I've watched. There's things like Gravity Falls, Adventure Time. They're all sort of in that kids space and usually animated because I guess it's cheaper. Would you say there's more chance of being able to sell an original one if you're more kind of pitching it as animated that may be cheaper to produce?
Well, animation is not necessarily cheaper to produce than live action, but I would agree that, yeah, you do have a better chance of getting a fantasy show made if it is animated. And that's just
Sorry,
because...
let me rephrase that. Cheaper to produce within the fantasy genre.
Oh, yeah. So compared to compared to other types of cartoons, it's equally expensive to draw fantasy as it is to draw people sitting around and talking, right? So within that world, it is comparatively cheaper to make fantasy in the animated medium for sure. So yeah, I think especially in the kid space, which you mentioned, a lot of fantasy is sort of more assumed going into it, or that veil between the realistic and fantastical is just assumed to be a little bit lesser. Like, there's this great question: is Calvin and Hobbes fantasy? And it's like, I don't know, not really, but so much of it takes place within the kid's imagination that it might as well be.
Like Amazing World of Gumball, is that fantasy?
I have not seen that. What is that one about?
It's bizarre. It's about these 12-year-old boys living this life, but like one's a cat, one's a fish that was adopted and became their brother after they got him as a pet from this weird person who sells stuff. Mm-hmm. The mom's a cat, the dad's a rabbit, he's got a little sister, and then it starts to get really existential towards the end. So, like the last episode is their world's imploding because the animators have run out of paper to animate, and basically everything's kind of collapsing in on themselves. It's really bizarre.
Okay. So in that case, I think it depends on how fantastically the things in the world are treated. Like something like BoJack Horseman also takes place in a world where everyone's an animal, but I don't think anyone would call it a fantasy show. Because it's pretty much treated with, like, it's like the animal people are almost just like interpretations of actual humans. More so than, like, occasionally there will be a throwaway joke. It's like, BoJack eats an apple or something like that, because horses like to eat, or eats a sugar cube or whatever, right? Like, it's kind of just used for throwaway jokes here and there. It's not really an intrinsic part of how that world is built and how it works. It doesn't really have any fantasy tropes. So I think when it comes to cartoons, it depends on how much you play into, like, utilizing those fantastical elements for their sense of wonder, as opposed to just sort of portraying them as metaphors or interpretations of real-life stuff. Go ahead.
Yeah, I'd say it's a combination of both. Because, for example, the mum works in the Rainbow Factory, which sounds really magical, but when they go there, it's just like this really dull office where she's working, and the magic is like what's produced because of her work. So it's kind of, but it plays on, like there's some episodes where it's just a musical and everything comes to life, and where they find what they think is Father Christmas, and their parents are saying, "Oh, it's just a hobo on the street," and it turns out it is Father Christmas. Like,
okay.
That kind of thing.
So that one sounds like it plays pretty fast and loose with the idea of reality versus fantasy. It just, I think, especially in the animated kind of space, it all blends together a bit more. I would consider in the world of animated fantasy shows would be the ones that lean into the tropes more. That we have magic, we have elves and dwarves and different species interacting in a way that they are not just people with different suits on. Like, the different species actually matter, and there are fantastical rules at play. We would just lean into the tropes more with that capital F fantasy. I have a slide on that we'll get to in just a few. Thank you for the question, though. So you are in deciding which premise you want to pick and which show you want to write, you are incentivized to pick something that has that element of that kind of name recognition or something like this. I see some ideas in the chat. Some people are mentioning video games they think would make good adaptations, like Devil May Cry and Bayonetta. Yeah, I think there was a Devil May Cry cartoon at one point, or maybe it never got out of development. I can't actually remember. Adapting D&D campaigns. Yep, we've seen that a little bit. That actually that's an old tradition that goes back to. There's the most famous example of that, I believe. There's a Japanese novel series called Record of the Lodos War, or it might just be Record of Lodos War. There might not even be an article. But that is famously like a novel that is a series of adaptations of somebody's D&D campaigns. And if I remember correctly, Dragonlance novels were also inspired by the author's home campaigns.
I have one that's been explored in video games a lot, but has not been explored in TV shows.
Sure.
there's this game Kenshi, and it's this weird sort of post-apocalyptic sci-fi high fantasy biopunk. It's gritty. It's has like robots and samurai and stuff. And I've seen all these elements in video games, but no one's ever made it into a show.
That sounds cool. So yeah, the sort of post-apocalyptic mashup space. I think you mentioned Enter the Badlands a little bit earlier too, which kind of like has a bit of that vibe as well, but it's sort of interpreted through a wuxia lens, which is cool to see. Adventure Time is also post-apocalyptic fantasy, which some people forget, but it takes place in this, scorched earth after a nuclear war, where seemingly, I don't know if that's what caused magic to return to the world, or if it just did after almost all of humanity was wiped out. But yeah, I think the sort of post-apocalyptic space has a lot of potential for the fantasy TV.
It's very like primeval. It's sort of like people rediscovering ancient technology and all of that kind of thing.
Yeah.
The Horizon Zero Dawn game has that element.
Right, I love that stuff. One of my favorite novel series, The Shattered Sea by Joe Abercrombie, seems at first to take place in a kind of Viking-style fantasy world, but the more you read, the more you realize, oh, I guess this is like after some kind of apocalypse, and there's sort of like ruins of ancient structures and vehicles and things like this that they consider to have been built by elves, but it seems more like they were built by humans from before the wars. That's always a cool thing to draw from, the sort of post-apocalyptic or dying Earth subgenres of fantasy. I agree, that's a good space. Somebody also, I think, mentioned folktales in the chat, which, yeah, that's a great fit. We mentioned fairy tales, but folklore, the world of folklore, is a great spot to draw from, especially in the very culturally specific space nowadays. A lot of people making shows are looking for that element of cultural specificity. Okay, so let's look at some just practical steps for writing a fantasy show, pilot, whatever it is. Most pilots will not turn into shows, so I would think of this mostly as writing pilots, not as I'm making a full TV show, where I have to plan out all the episodes and plan out all the story arcs for Season 3 and Season 5. You don't have to do that. You only need to write the pilot. Just remember that. Your show is probably, or your pilot is probably not going to become a multi-million-dollar production, especially if it's in your first couple pilots. More often than not, these are going to act as samples that will potentially be able to get you meetings to be staffed on other shows, and that's just how the industry works. You're unlikely to be given the keys to a $100 million company right out of the gate. So, to that end, let's look at just the practical steps for writing our pilot. We're going to not spend way too long on this slide because we have plenty of other stuff to cover, but we will just look at this as almost an overview. So to begin with, we're going to want to find the premise of our show, and the fantasy premise might be otherwise defined as our sort of central speculative elements. So is this a show about a wizard? Is it the world that's fantastical? Does it take place in our world where there are fantastical things? So is it ours? Is it a portal fantasy where a character can travel between our world and another one? Or does it feature a fully secondary world, which is the name for when you create another world entirely from scratch, that may have parallels to ours in some ways, but it does not need to? So, to begin with, you just have to sort of pick what is fantastical in my show, and within that, you sort of want to then start to refine down and figure out your hook. The hook of your show will tell you not just, okay, it's a show that takes place in a world with wizards. Okay, that's a good starting point, but from there we have to get more specific. Which wizard is this about? And what does your wizard actually do? Is this a show about a wizard that does heists? Is it a show about a wizard that's a chef? Is it a show about a wizard trying to become a ladies' man? You have to kind of find that element of focus within the world, and this is what novelists really struggle with sometimes, is portraying and packaging this in a simple to understand way, where more often than not, you don't want to say, it's like a vast saga of many different competing factions and families and thrones and countries who are all competing for the blank and the blank of the subsection of the Illyrian crystal, and we're like, what are you talking about? Normally, it's simpler and easier if you find some sort of element of focus that is easily expressed in just a couple words, right? Oh, it's a show about a wizard that is a serial killer. That sounds cool. And raises some other questions, right? Is he killing normal people? Is he killing only other wizards? Is it about a wizard that kills other wizards and takes their powers? That's kind of like, what's it called? Heroes, Season 1, right? It's sort of like a wizard. It murders other wizards and eats their brains and takes their powers and accumulates them, so he's, of course, the biggest bad guy of all. Heroes Season 1, great example of a fantasy show. Later seasons, not as much. First season, very much. But, so you want to find that focus. even if you have a cool idea for a world on its own is not enough for a show. A world is the basis for a story engine and can factor into your story engine, but you need to find that idea, or like funnel down to that idea of who is doing what characters are doing what specific interesting thing that sort of tells me if I would like this show or not. Like, we want to find that specificity of action to the point where we can kind of narrow down what is the appeal of this and who would enjoy this. Is this a show about dragons trying to find love? Or is this a show about a bounty hunter that can travel through time? You know, you got to find the really simple way of usually just portraying it as like, it's about a blank, who does blank is a great place to start in terms of just cementing and solidifying that central hook. This isn't like writing novels where we can be like, well, it's a vast tapestry and there's so many stories within it, I don't even know where to start. Like, that's just not a good way to pitch in the screenwriting world. So, find your point of focus and specificity. Tell us it's about who doing what in what world. And that's going to help you build out your story engine. And of course, it's going to tie into your subgenre, because who and what your world is interested in and your narrative is interested in is going to affect the subgenre that you fit into and the specific tropes that you're going to be utilizing more. Some tropes make more sense to use in some worlds than others, and you can always, of course, mix them up and find different ways to make different tropes work. Maybe you turn some tropes on their heads, or maybe your entire world building is predicated on turning one or two tropes on their heads. You know, something like, a zombie that's actually the hero, like that show iZombie on CW. Something like this or you take like a traditionally villainous character and make them the hero, take a traditionally heroic character, turn them into the villain. That can make a good, interesting starting point in terms of just that basic hook and subgenre. So in finding the subgenre, you will find the sort of stuff that your characters will be doing, because in Sword and Sorcery, we're doing very different stuff than we're usually doing in like a historical romance, for instance. And it'll help you find that direction and trajectory of character action. So all of that, all those things together we just mentioned will go towards building your story engine, which is not just one simple sentence that expresses. Your story engine's not just expressed in just one word or one sentence. It's like a combination of everything else that makes it feel like there is enough fuel here that will create more episodes that will last for many years. Or if it's a miniseries, it will last for about one whole season. And the story engine should be evident from your loglines. So the loglines are those sentences that express simply what is the show about. The pilot logline tells us what happens just in this very first chapter, whereas the series logline is telling us what is more happening in the grander arc of the show. What is the overall conflict, or in the terms of a status quo show, where we reset to 0 every week, it's going to be more like, what are the types of conflicts that are going to be continually generated in this interesting world that will act as that springboard or that source, that wellspring of many different types of conflict, one type of conflict, but many different specific conflicts within that type. So you've got your log lines nailed down. From there, you have to work on your cast list, your list of recurring characters. That's going to be major, minor. Major is going to be characters that will be in future episodes, and minor are characters that would only be in your pilot. So that's how I usually kind of distinguish them. And but within that, we have your protagonists, antagonists, central relationships, and that could be on both sides. You could have multiple different factions that are portrayed as villainous or heroic in different ways. Protagonist or antagonist does not necessarily tie into these paradigms of hero or villain. And then from there, once you've got your characters, your loglines, your story engine, your world all worked out and all in service of that premise that you were building, then that's usually going to be enough for you to break it into beats. So you have your 5 acts or your 3 acts, and you're going to just make a list of the major events of the story that are filed under the appropriate act heading or the appropriate structural heading. So once you know how structure works, then you're going to be able to identify what should go where and how to escalate and how to build and raise the stakes. And you can kind of map that out in your story beats in a pretty simple way that leaves some things out. It doesn't have to include absolutely everything. And then from there, once you go into beats, you can go to one-sheets or you can go directly to cards. I recommend a one-sheet nowadays. I've started adding it and including it in the past few boot camps just because it's something you have to write so many of and there's so little practice or education that goes into it. But a one-sheet is just a one single-page summary of the story written plain text prose that goes through the major story moments and tells us the whole thing from beginning to end. And then a scene card outline is going to be even more specific than that. That's going to be breaking out where every scene starts and ends. It will include, so the page numbers, page 1 to 2, this scene, page 2 to 3, this scene. And then it's also going to summarize what happens in those scenes. So about a paragraph each Tells us whose scene is it, what are they trying to do, what's standing in the way, what tactic do they use to overcome it, what happens, do they succeed or fail, and how do we transition to the next moment, what is the impact on the character. That's usually the basic info that scene cards are going to cover. And then from there, once you have all that pre-writing done, that usually takes your first 3 weeks, you'll go into pages. Going to pages means you actually start writing within your screenwriting software, which you can now download at that point. You don't have to download screenwriting software up until you have all your outline done. But in any case, I'd recommend Writer Duet or Arc Studio. And you are going to be starting pages using your scene cards as your guide, marking them up as you complete them, and keeping track of your progress all the way up until you get to the end. Only 25 easy steps and 10 easy payments of $59.99. You can see there's a lot that goes into this. It's not an easy thing to do, and even professionals struggle to write a strong pilot. It's very hard to balance all these different factors and to tell a story that is fundamentally incomplete, which a pilot is fundamentally an incomplete story because you are promising there's more of this, and at the same time, it feels as satisfying as a complete story would. So it has elements of a complete story, but not all of them. It doesn't have a sense of full closure, and in fact must keep some of those threads open to feel like there is more route to go down, there is more show, there is something after this. So it's tricky. Very, very, very difficult to write a pilot that fulfills all of the requirements, spins all the plates, and catches them at the end that you need to, leaves us feeling satisfied, but also like we can't wait to have more. Tough stuff, but writing is hard. Let's look at just recap basics of premise versus status quo. Premise shows are more like a long movie where we need to watch them in order, and each episode is a chapter of that longer story, and the characters are going to change more drastically over the course of many seasons. Meanwhile, status quo shows, this continuity format means that each episode resets characters back to the status quo, the way things were. You can tune into any episode, any season, and still follow the general story. The characters don't change as much, or not at all. Most cartoons, most sitcoms, and most procedurals fit into the status quo space. Premise shows work great with mystery and drama plot types. There's lots of room for subplot and character development, multiple timelines, and just digging very deeply into characters. Story engines usually center around a common conflict that multiple characters are trying to solve. This conflict could be the characters trapped in some sort of situation they're trying to get out of, like Lost. Or it could be a mystery like, who's the murderer? And the more that we dig into it, often that question will expand in scope, and we will add more questions, and every revelation will lead to more questions. Status quo, stakes either are lower, or we can do a hard reset where the dead characters are somehow alive again every episode. I mentioned last time in our horror class, Courage the Cowardly Dog was my example of, sometimes Eustace gets turned into a chicken or roasted alive or evaporated or something, but he's back next episode, and we don't really question why. Usually this works better in comedic or animated just because of the Western world's understanding of how those genres work. And the story engines are often going to be centered on some central location that provides unlimited mysteries, threats, or adventures. Something like Adventure Time's Land of Oo is a place that there's always something interesting happening. And our characters, they can be kind of anywhere in the world at the start of any episode because the expectation is they're almost like questing knights. They're looking around for stuff to do. They're looking for princesses to rescue, treasure to find. Essentially, they're playing it like people play a video game. Story engine is this amalgamation of several elements that sum up to create conflict in the show and that are going to sustain many episodes of a theoretical series. It should be pretty clear how this is working from your series logline. Ultimately, this is going to fuse your characters, story world, and situation together to continually generate recurring conflict, and potentially hundreds of hours of TV. So you're going to want to ask this question, what's unique about the characters? What do they want, and why do we want to watch them try to get it? What's the world of the show, which is a huge part of fantasy TV? Who are the types of people or non-people inhabiting this world? How do new people intersect with those main characters? So the characters that we're just introducing in the pilot, how do they fit in or not fit in, or clash or collide with the characters that have already been in that world? Often if you have that sort of newbie, newcomer type of character that's being introduced, like the Portal Kid going into Narnia or something like this, then you have a character that is on the same page as the audience that needs to be introduced to this sort of new fantastical stuff. Or it could be like Carnival Row, where you just drop us right in the middle of it and we're just left to sink or swim and figure out the dynamics of the world as we go through it. Some things that might make good story engine elements. Profession is often a good place to start, especially if we even have this list of like jump starts that are like, I solve crimes related to X premise for a living, or I'm a lawyer for X, or I'm a doctor for X. Domestic servants or aristocrats or teachers or students or bosses or employees or mentors or apprentices. Any of these things can just make great professions that are a good jumping off point for your fantasy show, regardless of if the characters ultimately, like, their actions that they do even necessarily connect to what their profession is, or sometimes they can contrast what their profession is. Think of something like Pushing Daisies. He's a pie maker, but it's not like a pie of the week show exactly. It's more like a crime of the week show. But the fact that he works at the pie shop is like, it still factors in as a centralizing element to the show. It's just not like, he's not a detective, he's an amateur detective that is a pie maker, right? So in a cozy detective kind of space, usually we have characters that are brought together by something else, by the book club that they're in, or by the I don't know, they all drink mimosas in their lawn chairs, and because they all hang out, they solve mysteries. Something like that is just really common in the cozy kind of space. Unifying goals or problems are great, and really common as well. These will be everything from your Dark Lord is trying to start the apocalypse, to rivalries or wars, arguments, alliances, coping with incarceration or workplace settings, battles for power or control of businesses or kingdoms or institutions. All these can become unifying goals or problems, and they can be zero-sum games, or they can not be. The difference being that zero-sum game means that only one person can win. You know, in the Game of Thrones, you win or you die. Or it can be the sort of thing where multiple characters could potentially win or team up in different configurations. Obviously, in the Game of Thrones, your cabinet comes with you, so it's not necessarily only one person can win, but only one person can sit the Iron Throne, as we know. Problems with high school or college settings. A lot of shows, I've often warned about these just because the story engine can be tricky, but they can work well for especially animated. And in the fantasy world, like, it makes for great sort of portal settings, or perhaps you are in a school or college setting that is already in a fantastical world, like Harry Potter kind of stuff. Can work well also. People love educational settings where people have to learn about the magic or whatever alongside the characters. Just, it's evergreen. Shows about families, you can ask questions like, how do they intervene in each other people's lives or each other's lives? How does the show continue to pull in new characters into their stories? And you could take the Modern Family approach, which is where it's primarily going to be through relationships, or it might be like The Office, where it's primarily through jobs that they do, or something like this. Or you might look at a family of doctors that every week they have a new patient or some medical crisis they need to deal with, so that most of the new characters are going to be experts in the fields. Or we might be dealing with spies or gangs or something like this. In any case, if you do that family kind of show, it helps to combine that family drama with some sort of other story element, like, think of a show like Sons of Anarchy, where it's like, this is a family, but they're also a gang, or this motorcycle gang, which kind of gives them more reason to hang out beyond just, well, we're related, so we have to. Okay, so why don't you guys tell us about a show that you like? Tell us about what the story engine is. How does it work? How do the character dynamics work together to create conflict? What is the larger unifying problem or unifying profession that the characters are dealing with? What brings them together and keeps them together? You can either speak aloud by unmuting, or you can use the text chat by mousing over the classroom channel and clicking the word bubble that says Open Chat. I will call in a volunteer in just a second.
I can get us started if you like, Connor.
Okay, go for it. Thank you, Becky.
So I am picking Supernatural, and while that might be seen as horror, I think it does realm in going to the realm of fantasy, because especially in later series we start seeing dealing with angels and even fairies at one point. The thing that keeps them together, the two main characters, they're brothers, but you keep having this flip, like we call it the mid-season breakup. They end up breaking up like every other season, it feels. But they keep flipping with when one character doesn't want to be involved. Like at the beginning, Sam doesn't want to be involved because he wants his life. He's a younger brother, and he wants his life at uni. And Dean is like has been fighting all these like monsters and wants Sam to help him.
Can we go to the basics? Why are they fighting monsters?
It's family tradition. They were raised in it. So Dean wants to do it because that's how he's raised. Sam thinks they had an awful childhood and he just wants to be normal and go to uni and just be normal.
Okay, so they're like vigilante, superhero, monster hunter types?
Yeah, and we do find there's this bigger world with more hunters, but basically it comes down to the fact that their mum died when Sam was a baby, and their dad raised them to be monster hunters from a very young age. And Sam resents that, and Dean's loyal to his dad.
Okay, interesting. And so, do they get paid for it somehow, or how are they getting by?
They get by through like credit card fraud and things like that. They don't get paid. Sometimes people will call them. Yeah, basically. Sometimes people will call them to help and will pay them for it, but yeah, they don't. They're just casually trying to make the world a better place. The series opens with Dean breaking into Sam's house and basically saying Dad went on a hunting trip and he hasn't come home. And that's the reason why Sam gets brought back into it. And Sam's like, I am just finding Dad. I've got my I can't remember if he's applying for uni or he's already at uni, but he's like, I've got my exams coming up. I'm just here for Dad. You know, doing one case and ends up getting drawn in.
Drags him in. But sounds like a miserable life, to be honest.
It is, and it's really interesting because there's times when like Dean finds someone he likes and he wants to settle down with, and he doesn't want to be it anymore. And at that point, Sam's the one that's like, no, we're making a difference. You got to come back and help me. So it's a really interesting dynamic. I mean, I thought it worked for the first few seasons. As far as I'm concerned, the 5 seasons, that's the arc. But it worked really well because it's like when one wants to do it, the other doesn't, and so there's constant tension.
Yeah, that makes a great push and pull in the central dynamic. If you always have one character that's unsure, or, I mean, usually you don't want this to be your, like, A-story lead, but your lead is the one that's like, no, we gotta go do the adventures and stuff. And then your B-story character, it's okay to have a character that needs to be dragged along a little bit, as long as they get... Go ahead.
You're right. In the beginning, in the first couple of seasons, Dean was definitely the main character. But then when they find out their roles they're meant to play, because it goes even bigger and Sam's meant to be the vessel for Lucifer and Dean's meant to be the vessel for Michael, it actually switches and then it becomes more Sam's main story. And he's the one that's then saying to Dean, no, we've got to keep fighting this. Like, you're all right, you got Michael. I don't want to be the devil's vessel. Right. You know?
It's usually easy to invest in a character that's like, hey, let's go do the cool fun thing that the show is about, rather than the character that's like, no, let's not do that. Let's go live a normal life that's not going to be a good TV show. That usually is going to be the character that needs to be brought on board, or that needs to be convinced or captured perhaps in some cases and forced to participate. But by the end of the episode, usually we should understand they're on the same page. So I'm guessing by the end of the pilot, they're like, okay, we're a team now. Here we go, fighting monsters.
Yeah, I believe it's in the pilot. Basically, he comes home. Sam comes home prepared to. I'm 99% sure it is the pilot. Dean's like, all right, fine, case is done. I know I've got the trail. I know where Dad was going. And Sam goes home, ready to do his plan. I think he is at uni, plan his exams, and blood drips down, and he looks up, and it's his girlfriend who is doing it all for. And she's dying in the exact same way that his mum died, which is by some demonic force that's pinned her to the ceiling and then starts a fire. And for him, that's his thing of, yeah, I'm going to get these bastards.
I see, yeah. There's no unsafer thing to be than a spouse or girlfriend or boyfriend of a main character in a long-running fantasy show. It basically guarantees you will die horribly.
Yeah. But I do argue it is a fantasy show because while it has some horror episodes, overall, I think we talked about this.
Right.
Because they know what they're doing. because they're confident in what they're doing and they know how to fight the monsters. It's not very... We're not necessarily scared because we're confident that they can do it. We're more intrigued about how they're going to do it.
Yeah, it's got horror elements for sure, but it sort of is so everything in the kitchen sink that any episode is sort of just whatever they need it to be in terms of tone.
Yeah. Like the Scooby-Doo episode where they go literally into the cartoon.
Scooby-Doo, especially in the later seasons of Scooby-Doo, also has that element of like, yeah, well, whatever we want to happen in it can.
I'm talking about Supernatural, the episode where they
they literally go into Scooby-Doo.
Yeah.
That's funny. This is one of the shows that I even the fans I know say it has jumped the shark like 4 separate times. Let's not even get into Riverdale.
Yeah.
There it is. Mario mentioned Riverdale, of course. Luke, do you want to talk about Penny Dreadful?
I can try.
Go for it.
Basically what I wrote here. So you throw all these famous supernatural figures from literature, Victorian literature, together. You have Dr. Frankenstein, you have his monster, who's a bit like Phantom of the Opera, weirdly. You have Dorian Gray, you have the werewolf, and then the psychic, demon-tormented sorceress is the main character, who's sort of an original character to hang all these other relationships on. And it's all just about a mystery, this big overarching mystery involving like Dracula and witches and that kind of thing. But it's really just about who's fooling around with who and who's going to kill who, that kind of thing. Just lots of sex and violence, basically.
Yeah, we've got some soapy stuff. We've also got that big... Isn't Dracula the big bad? Isn't he like the sort of main villain?
Yeah.
Right.
Spoilers.
Sorry. We do have... we have the central villain, the unifying problem. And then you have, your cast of characters. It's basically Van Helsing or League of Extraordinary Gentlemen, where we can sort of draw them from public domain gothic horror stuff. It's like public domain gothic horror superhero team up, essentially.
Yeah. It's pretty apt.
Except for our two leads, these two who are both originals, I think. Eva Green's character and, is it Charlie Hunnam, this guy?
Yeah, but he's basically the Wolfman, like, let's be real.
Oh, is he the... yeah, that's right, okay. But to begin with, he's sort of just like, cool bounty hunter guy.
Yeah, Wild West man.
Guy with gun guy, I guess you could call him to start.
Yeah.
So we have unifying problem and sort of unifying profession in that they're all trying to oppose and kill the forces of Dracula's evil. Much like in Castlevania.
And there's lots of betrayal and, sexiness. I don't know. Just,
of course. Something about the gothic world is surprisingly horny, or maybe not surprising. It just is. But I guess for all the extravagant dresses and things like this, and all the prim and proper society, people like those shows to get down and dirty, and they often do. So we're talking about the engine of shows. Hopefully it's clear what we mean here. How about, excuse me, and how it's about more than just any one element. It's a combination of all elements, and how these things work together to unify your characters in terms of objective, problem, and other bonds that are going to keep them together and keep them from just going their separate ways and saying, okay, the show's over, we all go home and do our own thing. It's what makes it feel like more than a series of separate, disconnected situations, and it makes it feel like a unified situation. It feels like a coherent situation in which every episode will congruently lead to the next thing, and it will build logically to some sort of culmination of that unifying problem. Okay, let's look at some new slides. So, to begin with, we've mentioned this a little bit. Fantasy's kind of everywhere. Fantastical elements, which are things that are not possible and will never be. That's the distinction from sci-fi elements, which are things that are not possible now, but could theoretically maybe be one day. They appear in many ways throughout all media, from Bugs Bunny, pulling out a giant hammer from behind his back, to The Conjuring, which is essentially urban fantasy after the second movie, where, the third movie is just this is just supernatural now. We've gone from this being The Exorcist to this having, ghost samurai and stuff like this. We're just in a ridiculous world after the second movie. Many other franchises and genres sample from this palette. Capital F Fantasy, though, is going to lean more heavily onto tropes and make these elements more foundational to the world. They're going to involve more world building, whether it's secondary world, portal, or modified reality. They're going to involve more magic, alternate species, creatures, and things will not be portrayed as metaphors. They are intrinsic aspects of how this world and story work. Castlevania, for instance, is a story that the opening scene is a demon army descends on a village and rips everyone in the village to shreds. It involves demon armies, vampire lords, and wizards summoning swarms of daggers to shoot at each other in every single episode. That's fantasy with a capital F. True Detective flirts with the occasional supernatural implication, but never really manifests it, allowing these things to kind of play out in the shadows and in the imagination and at the fringes of the audience's mind and things like this. Not a fantasy show, but draws in some small way from the fantasy palette. That's the difference. Capital F is going to lean more heavily on those tropes and make them more intrinsic to the world. Hope that's clear. I haven't taken many questions so far, so I'm going to pause here and just see if there's any questions on all the topics we've discussed up until now.
Besides high school, is there anything you should not do in a fantasy pilot, typically?
Anything you should not do in a fantasy pilot?
What's wrong with high school?
Well,
there's nothing wrong with high school. It just comes with some considerations and concerns. I mean, yeah. I guess I wouldn't say there's anything that you necessarily that there's no subject matter. Go ahead.
I say for writing for kids, having a school setting is kind of crucial.
Yeah,
well,
I mean, that's
all
just
caveats.
kids' lives. Yeah.
Yeah.
One thing I would suggest is sort of maybe just a space where some people sort of steer wrong, and I would say it's over-fantasization of the real world to the extent where it feels like people don't matter anymore. And the example I'm going to draw from is actually from Percy Jackson. So in the Percy Jackson books, we come to realize that every important person throughout history was an immortal demigod of some kind, to the extent that, like, Hitler was a demigod of some kind, and, like, almost every world leader was some kind of demigod. And things like this that just make it feel like, oh, so people can never do great things? Like, in order to do great things, you have to be a chosen one? And it just removes some of that agency from and importance of humanity. So I think over-aggrandizing the fantasy elements into your show where it feels like nothing important or cool or interesting can happen unless it's tied to those, that is a mistake in fantasy writing.
Okay.
Besides that, in terms of like subject matter or settings, I don't think there's anything that's strictly off limits. If you're exploring real-world parallels, like you're doing a fantasy show about the Holocaust or something like that, you should be more sensitive. But then again, we mentioned in a few classes ago, X-Men opens during the Holocaust, so you can totally do it.
I guess there are some limits that are just endemic to TV shows in general. Like, you don't want to do a show about a cat unless it's animated, for example.
Yeah, or it can talk, maybe, or... Sabrina the Teenage Witch had a cat that was just portrayed by a puppet, didn't they?
Puppet cat, yeah.
Yeah. So, yeah, I would say...
What about Lassie?
Go ahead.
Dogs are much easier to train than cats. And
this is true, but, you know, just saying.
Yeah, Lassie. I don't think Lassie is inherently is a fantastical premise, though, was it? That was sort of just like a dog that's smarter than most dogs?
And it's not really about the dog.
That's more just a fantastical premise.
Like, a typical Lassie episode is like 20 minutes of humans and then 5 minutes of Lassie doing Lassie things.
Yeah, Lassie just, like, performs the critical act.
It's like Flipper.
Yeah.
What was that really old one that was the guy in his talking horse?
Mr. Ed.
Mr. Ed.
Oh, yeah.
I guess that's fantasy. Yeah, it must be. I don't know how many tropes it has, so we may not call it capital F fantasy, but that's a fantastical thing, certainly.
That's what I was going to ask. Like, where do the lines... I know earlier we were talking about animation and how it can be fantastical but not be fantasy. Like, what are the lines? Like, yeah, what are the lines, basically? What makes something actual capital F fantasy as opposed to just being fantastical in nature?
Well, I don't know if we can draw a hard line necessarily. I mean, this behind me is sort of just like the guidelines. But we can think maybe when plot elements start relying on fantastical things, that I think for me is going to be the line where it's going to be a story that could no longer take place in the real world. It requires these fantastical elements for it to even happen or make sense. Then that's I think go ahead.
To say it's not really a line so much as a web, and if the web says super pig, then you know you're in a fantasy.
Okay, is this a Charlotte's Web reference? Super pig.
Charlotte's Web.
Okay, he is. So
I'm sorry about that. I apologize.
No, Charlotte's Web is a good example of fantasy too, because it's not just a metaphor. The spider is literally writing words in the web that the people can understand. So it's sort of almost like there's an underground world of animals that are smarter than they let on. That it's almost like Toy Story. Charlotte's Web is sort of like Toy Story, but with animals, like at the barnyard.
So I know it's not TV show, it's film, but like Babe, the pig that herds the sheep.
A pig that herds sheep. I've never heard of this.
Babe.
Oh, Babe.
Oh,
Yes,
Babe.
I do know Babe. I forgot that he herded sheep, but yeah.
For vegetarian, for creating a generation of vegetarians.
Yeah. Oh, I'm you.
Right. So that
would be
that one. I can't remember. Do the animals communicate with the people on some sort of level where they understand each other?
I don't think so. I think they just communicate with each other.
Okay. So to me, that one is a little bit different.
Please don't eat me.
But there is there is the whole thing of that the farmer notices Babe's ability and puts him in for a sheep herding dog role and wins. Like, that's very fantastical.
I guess. You don't think that could ever happen?
No.
Why not? Aren't pigs pretty smart?
It's a dog sheep herding thing. Like, dogs herd sheep.
Aren't pigs pretty smart and trainable, though?
Yeah, but not, like, they wouldn't be allowed to be entered into that sort of competition, and they wouldn't herd sheep.
You mean like
that's the whole point.
Per the rules, or per their actual biological capabilities?
Dogs herd sheep because they scare them into like that. That's the whole point of the story. Is that the reason Babe can do it is because he's given the secret code to make the sheep respect him.
Oh, okay. That does sort of push it a little bit out of the world of possibility. But I would think that
he tries to do it like a dog and gets kicked.
He
tries to bite the sheep and scare them, and they kick him.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
So I think that to the world of talking animal stories, it's a bit of a blurred line at times. I think when the animals don't in any way actually showcase understanding of our interaction with the humans, then sometimes we can sort of just interpret that as metaphorically, this is what the animals are kind of like, quote, talking about. And in those cases, I think we're less on the fantastical side, whereas Charlotte's Web, it actually involves, no, they can understand the people and write in human language and stuff like this. They just choose not to because they're trying to hide it from us for some reason. That is, to me, more on the capital F fantasy side. But Talking Animals is sort of in that children's / fairy tale world where it gets kind of fuzzy, literally. Okay, so let's look at some different genres and subgenres. This picture is kind of blurry, actually, so maybe I will go to my own slide instead. But we're looking at low fantasy, urban, contemporary, dark, high, and epic. Maybe we'll look at this instead because this is a little clearer. So, low fantasy, I mean, it's tricky to nail down Game of Thrones because, like, House of the Dragon opens with a dragon flying in the sky and coming to land. And we see that the dragons are like a bigger part of that story from the very beginning, whereas Game of Thrones starts a little more low-key, and at least the first season is more about people talking in castle rooms than it is about dragons, magic, giant armies, or spells, but we still do open with, like, ice zombies and things like this. In any case, most people classify Game of Thrones as lower fantasy because the magic is less obvious and less an everyday part of the world. It's largely political in terms of stakes and in terms of the conflicts, and it's mostly about characters vying for control of a kingdom. High fantasy, or epic fantasy, are going to be set in secondary worlds, and almost every time, unless there's maybe some counterexample, 99% they're going to be secondary worlds. They're going to feature huge stakes, often existential stakes related to the survival of that world, the reality, or of the kingdom, or things like this. They're going to feature lots of different characters in the cast, an ensemble that bands together to solve some unifying problem that almost always relates to some big evil that needs to be fought. And they are going to feature adventures and quests and lots of magic that can be part of everyday life. Different species, perhaps, of elves and dwarves and things like this. Rings of Power, Wheel of Time. Urban or horror is going to be Vampire Diaries, paranormal, the world of angels and demons sometimes can be portrayed this way. There's usually a stronger focus on romance in urban fantasy than in other ones, and in the horror kind of world, like sometimes we just blend over into pretty much straight up urban fantasy like Nosferatu. Sword and Sorcery Quest Fantasy, this is sort of seen as outdated and like it ran its course, and maybe Lord of the Rings blew it up to some extent, where we could no longer really even do that low-budget sword and sorcery thing that was a big thing in the 90s, like Xena, Hercules. Spartacus to some was a revival of this, but that's more like exaggerated historical than it is like traditional fantasy, at least what I've seen. Maybe there are straight-up fantasy elements in Spartacus down the line. I haven't seen enough of it to say. Anyway, Sword and Sorcery is going to be action-adventure type stories with more focused scope and stakes that are often more personal, and not necessarily epic, though they can lead up to being epic ultimately in the end. Usually this is coming from the Conan tradition of thieves and warriors and barbarians trying to just get the next treasure haul or something like this, though Xena is a bit more of a heroic approach to that. The characters are a bit more selfish and stakes are a bit lower. Historical is going to be perhaps also in the Gothic space. It doesn't need to be, but that's going to feature historical settings that have been modified, or maybe there are fantasy worlds that just parallel historical eras or cities really closely. Stuff like the Nevers or Carnival Row, which almost feels like Victorian England, but not quite. And I want to do a quick shout out to magical realism, just because this is not really a TV genre, but it comes up. Man-Seeking Woman is the only one I can really think of. But magical realism is a world where the fantastical elements are treated completely normally, or like in a completely banal way. Like it's not surprising, awe-inspiring, or like something to be remarked upon at all. Main character, the first episode, he gets set up on a blind date. It turns out it's with a little troll. And it's kind of like these are metaphors for things that would be happening in real life. Like, what if you got set up on a date with a really unappealing person, I guess? But then again, within the world, they are treated like they follow the rules of those things. Like, she's a troll, so we need to banish her with a spell or something like that. Like, it still does, like, stick within the tropes that it establishes for that sort of metaphor of the week. One of my favorite shows. World building. So we have four major types. We have your physical, social, local, and mystical. Generally, we're going to think a reader should understand enough concepts to follow the key events of your story by about 40% of the way through, I'm going to say, the pilot. Obviously, there can be elements in your world building in any of these four categories that are not fully unspooled in the pilot alone. It's going to take many more episodes to fully dig to the heart of how all these different things work. Physical is going to be the world itself and everything that would exist if humans were not there. Could include laws of physics and stuff like that. Social is going to be things that exist only because of people, cities, cultures, languages, societies. Local is going to be stuff that only exists within the space of your story itself. So that's going to be like, behind the tavern, there's a dumpster that leads into a world that's 10 years in the past or something like that, right? So just the elements that are right around your characters. Mystical is going to, I guess, we would usually call local world building the predominant one in non-supernatural media, whereas mystical will kind of supersede it in importance in supernatural media, and that's going to be sort of fundamental rules for the arcana or occult in your setting, meaning who can use magic and why, what kind of stuff can they do, what kind of magic creatures are out there, can they use magic too, can people come back from the dead, all the just basic constraints and restrictions on what can be done and how. Some terms to know. Learning curve refers to how long it takes to fully understand the fantastical and secondary elements in your world. A steep learning curve means it takes longer and there are denser concepts to grasp, whereas a shallow learning or a gentler learning curve is going to be a show that we can come to understand quite quickly. We don't need to know that many things. If you have opening text that can cover everything we need to know, then you have a very shallow learning curve. Fluency refers to your characters or readers' ability to understand and utilize, or the character's ability to utilize, and the reader's ability to, or the reader's willingness to accept the characters utilizing those fantastical elements to solve problems. Because we will always accept, as viewers, we will accept characters getting out of sticky situations using fantastical speculative elements more if we understand those things in advance, and we don't feel like you're just adding new rules or making stuff up as you go along. Magic system refers to a series of rules that governs a non-real thing in your world. They govern how a supernatural element within your world works. Different systems might govern different types of magic in your same worlds. There might be several different linked systems with different levels of hardness versus softness, which we're about to get into. I think let's define some of those terms first, then we'll go into species and magic. So, hard versus soft. This refers to how defined the rules are and how explicitly the viewer, the audience, gets to understand those rules. And the characters, like the extent sometimes to which the characters themselves come to understand those rules. It could be that there is a very hard system in place that your characters just never really figure out that well. Or it could be a very soft system that doesn't even have rules that are written down at all. Or maybe they work differently for everybody. Or maybe they're based on things like whims or dreams, or things that don't have as many constraints written down. Hard magic is useful for stories where you want the audience to sort of be able to figure out how those problems will be solved in advance, or maybe even theorize, if they use this spell, they could definitely do it. Or soft magic is going to be more tuned towards worlds where we want to bask in the sense of wonder, where we want to sort of be on the same page as characters that are not fully coming to grasp how this works because it's so beyond human understanding or beyond their understanding that it just feels more special in a way. Hard magic does take a bit of the specialness out of it. It gives it this more video gamey scientific feel, whereas soft magic feels more mysterious. It's up to you where you draw those specific lines and which elements in your world are going to draw from hard or soft sources. Wellsprings refers to where does the magic come from. The kind of basic delineation of wellsprings, at least in D&D terms, is arcane versus divine. Perhaps there are I know for a fact there are many other systems, religions, and folk traditions that consider other wellsprings to be at the basis of this, but in the Western world, we can use this as a starting point. Divine means magic that comes from God or gods. We would maybe even delineate it even further as you could say within divine you'd have a tradition like Judeo-Christian. Within the world of Constantine, Judeo-Christian magic, religion, is a magic system and is used as one. And in addition to that, you can blend in folk traditions with it or draw in elements of something else as you please. But to begin with, magic as described as in the Bible, it's like priests can do miracles when they are given power by God or channeling the power of gods through them. Or Satan, perhaps. Satan also being an intrinsic element of Judeo-Christian divine magic systems. So you might say that within your Judeo-Christian world, you have two different systems, one for evil magic, which derives from Satan as its wellspring, and one from God, which is going to be the holier magic. And within non-Western-centric or non-Earth-centric worlds, we may have something that kind of parallels this. It's like, quote, the church versus, quote, the adversary, or something like that, which kind of apes this dynamic, but doesn't necessarily need to follow those rules exactly. Something like a system from Garth Nix's Sabriel books kind of, in a weird way, does sync up with this arcane-divine dichotomy. Arcane, well, let me define that one first. Arcane being magic that essentially comes from the world itself, and the characters are tapping into it, bottling it, or hacking it for their own purposes. The Force is a type of arcane magic in that the Force doesn't really have gods or regulatory bodies that are determining who gets what. There's no entity that is in charge of the Force. People can tap into the Force and learn and figure out how to shape it and use it for their own ends. Within the Force, we have two different systems. We have light side and dark side, and then, of course, there are gray traditions outside of that, like the Dathomir witches and things like this, which we don't have to worry about. But in any case, all of it ultimately comes from the Force itself. Within your... and I was mentioning that the Charter Magic versus Free Magic from the Sabriel series, the Old Kingdom series, follows a similar paradigm where we have the kind of arcane, the free magic that's the wild, dangerous magic that anyone can find a way to use if you tap into it or hack it properly, but it's more unpredictable, versus Charter Magic, which is all written down and it's based on words and glyphs and signs and things that have very clear rules that have been laid out for them, and it's much safer and more controllable, but it doesn't have as much potential power. So one is a little bit safer to use versus one of them being, and one of them is more controlled versus more uncontrolled. And often magic systems have that sort of split or that dichotomy at the center of them, which might be a moral dichotomy, good versus evil. It might be that chaos versus law dichotomy, so one that is more controlled versus one that is more chaotic. It may have one that is based on a paradigm of healing versus hurting, for instance. That kind of ties to the good and evil thing, but it's good magic always heals and bad magic always hurts, for instance, or something like that. You can draw those distinctions however you want. Or sometimes it can be like techno versus natural. That's another common dichotomy we see, where this magic affects plants and organics, and this magic can only draw from or affect inorganic things like metal or machines or buildings. We have magic users that you have to determine who can actually use it and how and why would they use it in the first place. Is it common or is it secret? Is it illegal or is it free to use? We have schools of magic, which are going to determine the different types of spells that can be cast, or perhaps different families of spells, such as within the world of Avatar. You have your, elemental systems, fire magic versus water versus air versus earth. And then our last element that we want to factor in are spells or components. A spell being like a discrete magical effect, a discrete and replicable magical effect, even if it is consistently inconsistent in how it works. A spell does a specific thing. It is like a magical process that culminates with a magical result. And in order to get it, we have to use components and focuses, sometimes, depending on your rules, which are objects or processes that your characters need to fulfill or utilize in order to get those effects. Okay, that's the basic of magic systems. Before we go any deeper, let's just take questions on the essentials. Okay, if there's no questions, we'll keep going. Oh, go ahead.
Sorry. Yeah, no, I was just gonna talk about the benefits of hard versus soft for. I'm supposing that if I want to create a magical feel, i.e., for kids, I'd go for a softer magic system, so it's less defined and feels more wondrous, maybe.
You could, or you could go the other way and say this is something you can imagine yourself playing with because it's so replicable, right? Like,
Okay.
So yeah, in terms of age groups, like younger audiences usually can handle fewer rules and less complex rules, but you can still have rules, and with like having some rules allows the imagination sometimes to run wild. Like think of Harry Potter. Harry Potter is. I understand that between books the rules change and things like that. But we can all sort of imagine like the basic spells that Harry gets access to, Harry and his friends get access to, and what we would do with those, right? Like what's a fun one? Wingardium Leviosa. That's a simple, easy spell that makes something levitate. Easy, right? It does the same thing every time. I suppose
I feel like that's soft because you can replicate it, but there's no it's so hard. I don't really understand hard and soft. I think I'm just gonna ignore the hard and soft terms and just do what I would argue that Harry is soft magic.
Well, some aspects are.
It's flat. Okay, the magic system in Harry Potter it has to be something that the people think that they can do. So whether it's hard or soft, it's technically really soft because it's whatever she wants because she's not disciplined about her magic system. But as far as like her core principle of that magic system is that it has, at the end of the day, even the hard magic systems, right? They must be something that the reader thinks that they can do because it's all about immersion. It's first principle.
I don't think soft magic system means that the writer's not disciplined with their magic system. Often, I'm not arguing about her. I'm saying in general. Often, the writer knows it. Like Roald Dahl, his is very soft magic, but he knew how his worlds worked.
Okay, yep,
supposedly.
Go ahead.
So I understand that the reader, like the writer, should know what the system works, but then it's kind of like trust but verify. Like if I haven't ever seen the writer write a hard magic system, I don't think they have. Like it's like they're lazy, right? Like why would you do
It's not lazy.
I'm really against the soft magic system, so I'm being biased.
I'm against
change my thing.
Hard magic
I don't believe that they've actually completed the underlying core system because they don't need to.
But when you're dealing with magic like dreams, like the BFG, dream capturing, you know? There's nothing hard about that. That's a non-tangible thing, and the giants go dream capturing, and it's like...
Sure. Like, so let me constrain it to just, I think J.K. Rowling was lazy about it.
Okay,
I agree with that. Yeah,
let's
I
not talk
agree with
about
that.
writers. let's keep our focus on the stories and rules within those stories, not the writers themselves.
Okay. So in the Harry Potter's writer. Sorry, no, just no. For specifically, I just think that like the core first principle is that any magic system that is enjoyable, right? The reader himself thinks that they're able to do it. Even the most hardcore system, like the Brandon Sanderson stuff, right? The reader feels like if they can actually do it, you know.
That's
like,
an option.
That's
You can do that. That does work. That is a part of what makes some series fun. But then again, do I think I could do what Gandalf does? No, I have no idea what Gandalf can do exactly. His powers are kind of not enumerated within the franchise, except in the appendices and things like this.
So,
go ahead.
Can I ask then? I know this is about TV and mine's a book, but I'm writing it to easily be adapted to TV as well, so it is relevant.
Sure.
So mine is, I mean, I got the hard rules for necromancy. If you want to, or any of that magic, it's a give and take. So to bring something back to life, you've got to kill something of equal. You know, you can't just bring something back to life without killing something else. Like that's like necromancy. But I'd still say it's quite soft. Like, I'm not going into explicit details about how they're bringing like things back to life and, you know, insects or animals. She just kind of told, this is the spell, this is what you got to do, and she just sort of does it. It's I don't want it to be like something that kids can then go do in the playground.
Well, they could try. But wait, so let's go back to the rule. In order to bring something back to life, you have to kill something of equal what?
Like of equal like soul weight. So, for example, to bring like plants back, you got to kill other plant matter. So, you know, he'll go to be killing weeds to bring a rose bush back.
Okay.
And to her, that's nothing. Like, you know, oh, weeds aren't anything. Look at this beautiful rose bush. And then it'd be something like, you know,
it's
a
like
collection of
equal value or like equal importance almost.
Yeah, I mean, it is quite intangible in that sense because I want it to be that it doesn't occur to her that to bring her sister back, she's got to take a human life.
Right.
Right. So I'm being very careful about what is going to get her to bring back.
Right. So yeah, that's a good example of how you have sort of a hard framework, but with a soft rule within that framework. So your hard framework is, in order to bring something back to life, you have to kill something, but the softness is something of equal importance, which that's like a non-tangible idea, right? Like, what's important?
Yeah.
Important to who? And your character could theoretically spend all day charting it out and like killing things until she figures out what equals what, but because you don't do that, you leave that element more soft within your world. So if we explore a soft system more, your character can turn it hard. This is like almost more about the audience perception than it is about the actual rules in play. Because we can usually imagine there are some sort of rules in play. The characters just don't get to know them where they don't matter.
Yeah, because like the first thing she's going to say is, well, can't I kill like 20 mice? Wouldn't that be the equivalent of like a human, you know?
And he's like, hell no. And she's like, what about 10,000 mice? It's like, okay,
yeah, exactly.
Maybe 10,000. I don't know. That could work. So yeah, that's a good example of blending these two. That's why it's never like, it doesn't have to be a completely, I think you do understand, I think it's just not a completely hard line. Like, almost every system will have some hard parts and some softer parts. It's coming down to specificity and concreteness. So you can have a hard system that has some squishy rules within it.
Or a soft system that has some hard edges.
Yeah, definitely. Absolutely can do that. Like
cool.
And sometimes like we mentioned Harry Potter, sometimes those rules seem to be almost too replicable and we have to get rid of them and say we can never use them again because otherwise it would break everything.
Oh, the time turners.
Yes, so you know exactly what I mean. She's like, from then on you can't use them because shut up, that's why.
Wait, why? Wait, why? Explain on that. I'm curious.
The time turners. So in the third book, she introduced time turners that allows Hermione to go back an hour so that she can like do loads of lessons and everything.
Right.
And then suddenly she realised she was in a hole, because if they've got time turners, why couldn't Harry just use it to go like back and kill Voldemort before he killed his parents or things like that? And even if she put like an hour's limit or a day's limit on it, then the question is, well, if anything bad happens, Hermione's got a time turner, so why don't we just go get the time turner and undo it? So she had to have them all be exploded during a battle in the Ministry of Magic. Every last one of them.
I just take it all. Like, I didn't even ever think of that. I just gobbled it all up. But like, I totally see it now.
Right.
Yeah.
Most younger audiences will not hold you to the fire as much as older audiences will. Those older audiences will be the ones asking questions at Comic-Con, like Comic Book Guy from The Simpsons, where Lucy Lawless is up there like, if there's ever a question like that, then a wizard did it. And he's like, but what about? And she's like, a wizard did it. It's just like...
But by the time you got to the 6th and 7th book, the people that have been reading it have been reading it for like a decade. They're not like, at the end of it, it wasn't a kid audience anymore. It was like an older crowd.
That's
even
true.
The youngest reader of it.
That's a good point. So that's how, certain series do expand in complexity. Go ahead.
Sorry, I was in my 30s when I read the first one.
There you go.
I don't know about like how much older I could have gotten.
Yeah, so it's not just open to kids. Lots of adults read the series too, of course. Let's move on from Harry Potter and look at, because this has brought up some good discussions of principles of building your magic, and I want to bring up a couple new ideas here today. So we have this difference of unbreakable principles versus variables. And those are going to be we were just talking about hard and soft rules within the same world, right? And that's going to kind of be where we see that play out, or that's the ways that we define these different elements. Something that is always the same versus something that can kind of be different every time. That's a hard rule versus a variable. It's nice to have a bit of both. Magic can feel more robust and complete and sort of, quote, realistic in whatever way it is realistic, if there's some things about it that are literally always true. And then after we know those things that are true, there's some room for interpretation, or maybe even some contradictions within the system itself. I think of the First Law series by Joe Abercrombie, which is kind of it has like those sort of three, like the ultimate like core rules of magic that it lays out very clearly, and then it points out how they're inherently hypocritical. Because the first rule, the first law is you should never reach to the other side, meaning like contact demons, basically. But it's inherently sort of contradictory because you have to reach to the other side to do spells. So it's sort of like in order to participate in magic, you almost have to start breaking its own rules. That's kind of complicated. I wouldn't like stack contradictions at the start, but you can see how this contrast between unshakable principles and variables can be where your system feels really interesting and dynamic. And it can create interesting conflicts where your characters themselves are sometimes like, does that have to be a rule? I wasn't born with the Force. Can I have the Force imbued in me somehow? Whenever that happens in Star Wars, usually it's bad guys doing it. Does it have to be? So these are good questions to just start asking, and maybe they can give you ideas for story seeds. Think of things that would seem to poke holes in your system, and maybe ask, could the characters themselves poke those holes and figure out where the boundaries actually lie? Something else we might want to factor in is this idea of start with the baseline, not the exception. Because if we meet a vampire in your world and he can, fly and he can move around in the day and he has wings and he can breathe underwater, and then we meet another vampire that is green and can burrow under the earth and can, eat plants. Everybody can eat plants. Eat stone. And then 2 episodes later, we meet the normal vampires, and we're like, wait, what? You never told me what to expect. Or like, how am I supposed to understand a deviation from the norm if I didn't even know what the norm was? And obviously with things like that are well-known cultural ideas like vampires and things like this, you have a little bit of leeway to say, well, I don't necessarily... People already kind of know what the baseline for a vampire is, probably. So I can lean on that a little bit, but in your world, if you're introducing something brand new, like, let's say, I don't know, a soul ninja, then you don't start with like a really weird soul ninja and then show us another really weird different soul ninja and then tell us what soul ninjas are. We'll just be confused. So try to start by calibrating our expectations of what this thing is or should be before you start subverting or altering that. Like you see so many fantasy shows that start with like cave paintings of something, or like an old folklore book as we're leafing through and we're seeing these are what witches are supposed to be like. But they're not really like that at all. Slams the book and we show what they're really like, right? Or think of Shrek that opens with this fairy tale book. Ah, yes, far, far away there was an evil ogre that lived in the woods. But really, he's like this. We don't start with the exception. You build the rule and then show us the exception. So don't confuse us right off the bat. Number 3 is avoid the temptation to solve story problems by adding more rules or exceptions. Use the rules that you have in a deeper way, or sort of reinterpret those rules in different lights, or look at those rules from different angles or from different perspectives and ask, could something else fulfill the criteria of that role? Could I have my characters have to work and try a little harder, but to work within those systems? I'm going to give you an example from a realistic show, but this is just the principle that I would recommend that you lean on. For instance, in the show Mr. Robot, they had a lot of tech consultants on in order to ensure that they were portraying hacking correctly, because hacking is usually portrayed terribly in movies and shows. It's kind of just like people bashing a keyboard until they're like, I'm in the mainframe. But in that show, they really went the extra mile to make sure that it looks as boring and realistic as it really is. Or it doesn't have to be boring, but it's at least, as mundane and realistic as it would really be. And they came to a problem where the main characters needed to access a computer in a cop car in order to hack something on it. I can't remember why. And initially in the writer's room, if I remember the story correctly, they had the characters remotely hack it or access it. And their experts were like, you could never do that. It's no, these are very secure computers. You'd have to physically access it somehow. And that leads to a situation in which the characters have to sort of go the extra mile and work even harder to trick the cop and distract the cop and find a way to get somebody on the other side to reach in through the window and do some bait and switch and some sleight of hand and things like this that actually makes it more engaging and more interesting, because we use the rules that exist in a more we didn't add rules, we didn't change the rules, we used the existing rules in a more fun way. So that's sort of like a realistic example, but that's sort of what you're doing with the rules that you set up for yourself. It's not the best move to introduce an exception and say, well, okay, but they have a computer that can hack cop cars. That just feels like you just added that just now. That wasn't part of the world all along. That wasn't something we were factoring in. Whereas if you simply require your characters to work harder to follow the rules, it can lead you to cooler situations that feel more congruous or more congruent with the rest of the world as you have built it. So that's 3 of my big tips for thinking of magic systems for your pilots. Any questions on those ideas? Let's stay away from Harry Potter. I think that's too spicy. Okay, if there's no questions, we'll move on. So we're not going to design a new system now, but just some last considerations. Think of what can it never do. That can be part of the hard rules and constraints. Something it can't do. Limitations are just as, if not more, interesting than the powers. What components does it require? Is there a heavy cost with using it? Think of some problems that it could solve in interesting ways in the hands of a creative user. Maybe brainstorm a couple try-fail cycles where your hero would attempt to use the magical tools they have access to resolve their issues, and as they hit obstacle after obstacle, they're forced to change their tactics and adapt. I'm not going to go way into this, but I just want to show you guys what I consider to be a magic system document, or how to write out a magic system if you're trying to just write this alone. So you have to really limit yourself here. This takes up one single-spaced page. This is a format that I've made myself. Maybe there's actual better formats for this out there, but this is just what I use. And this is a breakdown of a system from a novel that I'm working on called Veins. And the magic system is called the Blood. The Blood being the source of the power. And so in writing out the system, the way that I recommend you try it is in 5 paragraphs or less. So you get 5 terms that you can define for us. Try to focus and narrow down to just the most important terms here. And you want to transition in terms of topics, so starting at the baseline and layering complexity on top of it, rather than starting with the exceptions like I mentioned. Start with the baseline, and then build one thing after the next, one rule after the next on top of that, and add complexity so that every paragraph that we read only relies on us knowing the things we read before it. Does that make sense? So you're layering rules in such a way that we never need to refer to paragraph 5 to understand this paragraph. You have to build them out in such a way that you are only using the terms we have learned so far. And it's really nice if you can end each paragraph with a transition into the next topic or idea. I'm just going to use this as an example. I won't linger on it too long or go into every aspect of it, but this is how the blood works. Okay, it starts with the concept of veins. That's the baseline, so I started with that because that is the wellspring of power, as in where the magic comes from in this world. So, the Earth is a tapestry of invisible ley lines, permeating the planet like the circulatory system of a vast organism. You might imagine sort of like giant invisible veins going through the Earth and the air and the sky and the trees and everything. These ley lines, called veins, carry the potent magical energy of all living beings. This substance is known as the blood. So it's sort of like the Force, but it can only be found in these specific channels. The various religions have different interpretations of this idea of sort of like the life source of all things. It's like Gaia, it's like the soul, it's like made of this same stuff. It all draws from the same stuff, called the blood. So, within the veins, these invisible channels that go through the world, it flows a spectral black substance resembling heavy, ice-cold, sludgy smoke. This is the ethereal manifestation of the life force that connects all living beings. Those who can access and consume it, for them, the blood is a source of immense power, which grants temporary access to body horror-themed magic effects, such as allowing you to, I don't know, absorb bullets or unfold bone scythes from your body, or crazy, like Devil May Cry, the witch subversion, kind of like combat-themed magic abilities like that. In addition, you receive sharpened senses and enhanced abilities. It lets you do Matrix stuff. However, the consumption comes with consequences, as the power that it brings is highly addictive, not to mention that rival gangs of blood users viciously contest control of the sites where the blood is most accessible. These places are called wounds. So, I'm not going to go through everything else here, but basically, wounds are the places where you can access veins. Mosquitoes are the term for people that go around from vein to vein looking to sort of drink the blood and gain immense power. They're like magic junkies that travel in these caravans, sort of like you imagine the mages from Dr. Sleep. Like these kind of trailer park mages who go from site to site, powering up and going on crazy crime sprees and things like this, and avoiding both other gangs and also these things called antibodies, which are kind of like Terminators that are spawned by the wounds themselves to try to defend the blood. And that's the system. 5 paragraphs, building in complexity, one thing after the next, with each term only relying on terms that we've already defined. That's how I would consider magic system documents to be best portrayed. Any questions on writing out a magic system? Great, no questions. Let's keep going. We've got plenty more to dig into. So, portraying magic. Portraying magic on screen is very different from doing so in a book, because in a book you can do so much more within the characters' minds and feelings. You can say, like, he wrapped his mind around the concept and he dragged it into his brain. It's like, what does that look like? If we were to see that on screen, would that look like a magical, spectral, shimmering purple fist exits the guy's head and grabs something and pulls it into his mind, or would that look dumb? You don't have to worry about what it would look like, because the fact that we can sort of imagine it ourselves gives us, the reader of a book, a lot of the ability to create the special effects ourselves, so to speak. You can leave more up to the imagination. When you're portraying magic on screen, I recommend avoiding this concept of invisible forces when you can, except occasionally sometimes to perhaps depict overwhelming cosmic powers. Invisible forces, what do I mean by this? This is when, I think... you'll sometimes see in a story about a possession or a haunted house, a character will just get picked up and thrown across the room, and they slam into the wall. Or an object gets picked up and thrown around, or like you have a character that gets like pulled into the sky by a god or an alien abducting them or something like this. So I recommend staying away from that unless you want to pick like cosmic horror, aliens, gods, or something like this that are interacting with the characters that sort of feel overwhelming and like we couldn't possibly understand what caused that or why that happened, or like what could have stopped that. When it comes to invisible forces, usually they feel much looser and flimsier, and it's helpful if you have actual visual causes of the things happening within the scene, whether that is a character that... So, like, you could have a character get picked up and thrown around the room. It's helpful if you have another character that's like, ah, yes, my voodoo doll. I will take my voodoo doll and throw my voodoo doll of that person, and that will make them get picked up and thrown from one place to the next. Or you could have a character that just thinks really hard and makes somebody die, or you could have them cut a string, or break a stick, or, like, do some visual thing that shows us that something is happening. that I think is usually in terms of TV where you want to be. And the examples I want to draw from today are largely from Constantine. I haven't actually watched the TV show, but I have read the comics and I have seen the movie 100 times, so I'm mostly going to refer to the movie. Let me just talk or speak to one more point before I go into Constantine. So, a little goes a long way. This is also a great TV and movie tip where sometimes you show less of the magic happening and it feels more mysterious or magical. Think of something like The Witch, the 2015 Robert Eggers movie that won Best Director at Sundance and things like this. Sometimes something being out of frame makes it feel more menacing or more mysterious or like scarier than what we otherwise would want to imagine. Think of the scene where Thomason speaks to the adversary at the end, Black Phillip, so to speak. He kind of stays in the shadows. We only see like his boots or his gloves or just like glimpses of him that make him feel sort of more powerful or more interesting, more mysterious. Sometimes just a character lighting a candle or taking a single drop of paint and putting it on something like that can feel more impactful, especially if it's played with a lot of importance around it. Like if we have a lot of build-up and music and tension leading up to your character just breaking a stick, that can make that event feel momentous and impactful, even if what we were actually watching was incredibly simple and non-exciting, non-visual. So avoid invisible forces and also consider that you don't need to have lots of CGI for something to feel magical and cool. Let's get into Constantine. So I really like how the arcane rules, components, and focuses are portrayed in this movie. Characters can't just pull magic out of nowhere, or humans can't. Devils and angels can, but humans often need tools, processes, and procedures of various kind in order to access these things. Whether that is the cat that John needs in order to go to hell, or the way that you gain the sort of sight to see demons, using that we have to drown you, and you have to essentially cross over the veil of death and come back. So the way that we do that is Constantine literally holds Rachel Weisz's character underwater in the bathtub until it shatters. It's like her dying and sort of being reborn from hell, and she emerges smoking as if she was just, in boiling water. So having that really visual element and the components and focuses really allow the magic to feel like it has you can even trick us into thinking there are more rules than there really are if you just give us some of those rules and show the characters accessing or using those magical things by operating the proper tools in the proper way. And those things can kind of feel sort of, the more that they feel sort of arcane or timeless, like these could have been rules that have been applied in various ways throughout all of history. That can be a great way to start as well. Like the cat could be something that people used hundreds of years ago. The light bulb thing that Papa Midnight uses in the basement of the club, I'm not quite sure if there was some version of that they used in the past, but it still is a very visual, cool way of showing that. Taking that like filament of a light bulb and stabbing it into John's chest is like just such a over-the-top, visceral way of showing the magic working. I also think don't show everything is a cool trick to use here sometimes, where I mentioned keeping things in the darkness, but sometimes like just refusing to show something can make it feel so much more impactful too. Think of when John goes to hell to find, I forget Rachel Weisz's character's name, but her sister, to check if she's there. He actually makes her leave the room. He's like, I'm going to sit in this chair with this cat. You have to go out. And then the second she closes the door, something happens, and she opens the door and sees him in there, smoking as if he was just on fire. So keeping some stuff off screen is a great way to build intrigue and interest around that thing and make it feel sort of more powerful and impactful sometimes. Cost and consequences. There are multiple ways that comes up in this story, but the clear one is after they go on this trip to a hell or heaven, I need to eat. Like, you see, it just really takes it out of people. Like, it saps your energy and makes you ravenously hungry, and just physically takes a severe toll on you. I also really like the cost and consequence of the demon sight thing. The fact that some people can see demons and angels comes with a very sharp and very obvious, very clear, easy to understand cost. You can see them, they can see you. And it just sort of makes sense. It feels like it has that element of balance to it, like it has a push and a pull. It has that sense of equal and opposite reactions can be really key in making hard magic feel like coherent and logical even within a series where it's not really, but you just sort of make it feel like it is. Push and pull, cost and consequence. Any questions on portraying magic on TV, or maybe great examples of magic portrayed you guys have seen before? We have a lot of fantasy fans here. I'm going to call on somebody in this one. We've done a couple sides with no questions. I think you guys have seen magic in TV before. What's one that you really liked?
I like Just Add Magic, and it's kind of young.
Okay, Just Add Magic. Is that a show or a movie?
Yeah, it was on Amazon. I think there were 3 or 4 seasons. It's about a girl who inherits from her grandma a cookbook that you create basically magical spells with special food and these rare herbs. When you add herbs, say, to lemon bars, right, it gives you, let's say, the ability to play a perfect game of soccer or whatever, but there's always a cost. But they don't learn the cost until after they do the spell, and eventually they start being able to foresee what the cost. It's all about kind of learning how to even read the book at first. And then over the series, her grandma is silent. She doesn't speak. And it turns out there's a spell that's been cast over her and like 3 of her friends. And so there's this arc over it where we unravel sort of this generational arc. But each week, there's a specific little magic spell in the book. I'm kind of going after that format for my own show a little bit. But it's pretty light. I think it's probably Y7. So like Dragon Prince age.
Sure. Yeah, that's a great hook though. So cooking theme, cooking magic system, and it sounds like they behave a little like potions, right? So it's like a recipe that creates a discrete magical effect.
But it's always food with some special herb. Yeah.
Cool. Yeah. That's a good example of how we can sort of take something unconventional like cooking or weaving or blacksmithing or like any other craft or profession and sort of find a way to turn that into a magic system. That can be really fun. Nice way of visualizing it. Go ahead.
It's really old, but Bewitched. I like the fact that for her to cast a spell, she sort of twitches her nose, so we know she's doing a spell. And the sound of the show, like, tells us that's what she's done. And I can't remember if sometimes it's actually sparkles or not, but like even if the spell is invisible, we know it's been done because she twitches her nose and there's like the chimey sound. So it gives us the indication that whatever's then happened to the other person is because of her.
Yeah, that's such a simple visual element that showcases how the magic is working. Like, it's helpful to have something like that. You could see it maybe in a book version of this, you wouldn't need that, but it's so useful in TV.
Have you guys seen The Magicians?
The Magicians? No. Tell us about it.
So The Magicians such as circumstances, and there's like 4 levels. The first level is like your hand gestures. They have to be at the correct angles, right? But depending on how close you are to like a body of water, the alignment of the planets, you have to adjust your lower level circumstances, like the angles of your fingers, right? Depending if it's like the Mars equinox, right? Then you have to adjust your angles of your fingers. So each level gets kind of adjusted by the like whatever circumstances are higher. So if a god gives birth to a baby, right, that screws up the entire magic system below it. So you've got to knowing what's going to happen, right, above you determines how you can use magic. Like
okay,
if the god, if you kill the god of magic, right, that kills the circumstances for the entire realm. Does that make sense?
So there's like an astronomical aspect to this one.
It's not just astronomical. It means that there's a layer above every layer that affects you. So it's like if someone farts in another planet, it might affect your circumstances of the magic that you're trying to create. And so you have your own personal circumstances, like your personality, that makes you more adept at a certain level of magic. So it goes all the way down and it goes all the way up. So it goes infinite in either direction. From internal personality to external global cosmic circumstances.
Okay, interesting. And this is based on a book series that I'm sure goes into even more detail than the TV show does.
No, it doesn't. It doesn't. It doesn't. The magic system was further cemented after he wrote it. he's not really a great magic system writer. It's just that like people force him to like kind of write it out, and so he just like kind of ekes it out little bit by little bit. Yeah.
Okay, good to know. Thank you for that. So we're to the end of our slides on magic and fantasy and TV. We've covered a lot of ground. We could either go into picture prompts, or your guys, do you have log lines or pitches for fantasy shows? We can do one or the other. Let's ask, does anybody have a log line or a premise for a show they want to get feedback on now?
I do, but I'm debating between whether it would work better as a TV show or a book.
Okay, do you want to ask about that and figure that out now, or do you want to wait?
I post the premise. Again, this is like half-baked. It's I came up with it when I was thinking about ideas for my mentor for the book, but then I was thinking I could see this being a TV show as well. So I'm kind of so there you go. It's a magical academy exists only in dreams, where kids from all over the world are secretly trained to become dream guardians who protect people from nightmare creatures. But when a small group of new students accidentally release the captured bad dreams into the real world, they must work with the strict deputy masters to recapture these nightmares in the real world. And then it would be, if it was episodic, each episode has them facing new creatures based on people's worst fears.
Okay, almost like Nightmare on Elm Street 3.
But for kids.
But for kids, yeah. Okay.
Yeah, like I don't imagine it being a horror. I imagine it being more there'll be scary moments, obviously, but it's not like Nightmare on Elm Street where it's a horror. It's more sort of wholesome feel.
Okay, Magical Academy exists in dreams. That is a great idea, where kids from all over the world are secretly trained to become dream guardians who protect people from nightmare creatures. So I have a question about that. Let me come back to it. But when a small group of new students accidentally releases the captured bad dreams, the kids must work with the strict deputy masters to recapture these nightmares in the real world. Oh, so they release them from the dreams into the real world. The kids must work with the strict deputy people to recapture these nightmares in the real world. Each episode has them facing new creatures based on people's worst fears. Okay.
Or if it's a book, then it would just be like the story of them going through recapturing.
Sure,
and there'd be some villain.
Questions. Are the deputy masters adults?
If it's a book, no. It'd be an older kid and it would just be one. If it's a TV show, probably, because in a TV show I've noticed that the kids tend to have an adult with them where they're doing most of the work and there's this kind of unhelpful adult figure.
Okay.
That's kind of beside them.
Because I mean, to begin with, it raises the question: why do we need kids to do this? And the simple answer seems to be, well, only kids can do this, or only kids have access to the dream world. But if adults can be the dream masters, why are they training kids to do it?
Yeah, it's basically, I was going to go along the lines of the kids are the only ones that can actually like access the dreams. The dream masters were once kids who did this job, who stayed on to train the next kids. So I was thinking that the dream guardian that goes with them might be an older kid that's losing that ability. So there's kind of that conflict of he knows that he's going to just become an office guy now.
Yeah, that's great. So I guess that question leads to just me wondering if that should be a big plot point, right? Like, rather than having adults be the mentors, have one of the key characters could perhaps even be an older a kid that's like at the end of his dream warrior, dream guardian term, and is maybe not happy about that, or maybe has some objection to that, or maybe could even, you can use that for plot stuff.
Yeah.
What else?
It could turn out that he was the one who released them, because then he could show his worth and stay around.
Exactly. Yeah, makes sense. Or, this would prove to the adults of the world that the dream stuff was real, and therefore now I'd be able to stay in this society somehow.
Yeah.
Could work.
I
Go
imagine
ahead.
there's like one or two actual like fully grown adults that like oversee everything, living in this dream dream world. They can't leave, but they've donated their
Yeah, I
lives
wonder what
to
makes them
training
different.
the kids.
So,
Um,
yeah, you don't have to know I know this is a new idea, so you don't have to know the answers now. But
yeah, no, that's a good question though.
I would think also maybe you could even say the younger you are, the stronger your dreams are, or something like that. And maybe even then the younger characters would have sort of an advantage, maybe your dreams are more volatile, or something along those lines.
Yeah, or you more easily slip into other people's dreams.
Right. That could be cool. Yeah, I could definitely see this working as a cartoon series, especially because the dream imagery it just is easier to portray in the animated kind of world.
Yeah.
Or at least easier to
That
portray
thing-
and not have it be horrifying.
If it's TV, I'd imagine it being a similar style to Adventure Time.
Sure. Yeah, for some reason I was thinking Foster's Home for Imaginary Friends, but that's kind of a similar look and feel.
Yeah.
I think it's a good premise, especially the idea of a place that only exists in dreams that only kids go to. That's a great sort of easy wish fulfillment kind of concept that I'm kind of surprised I haven't seen before. It's almost like this communal matrix that everyone can hack into. There's theories as to this collective subconscious that it kind of taps into, where this concept that has been pseudoscientifically explored before, but the idea that all human brains are like networked somehow. So it kind of taps on that. It's a very cool idea. I think you just need to maybe dig a little deeper into the source of your main threat. Is this going to be a problem of the week, or is this more like we accidentally unleashed the biggest, scariest nightmare of all, and now we need to spend many episodes gathering our forces to fight it, or something like that? So maybe just needs to be focused a little bit. Go ahead.
And what's your thoughts on whether this would work better as a TV show or as a children's book, a middle grade book?
I think it could definitely be either, but you have more chances of getting a show if there's a book first, so I would say book.
Yeah. That's what I was thinking. That's why I got into writing books.
Same.
Yeah, I think I might put this as one of my submissions to my mentor then. The only reason I was against it was that she said that they're not really looking for fantasy at the moment unless it's outstanding or a really unique idea. But maybe this would be unique enough.
Probably not, because it's just it's kind of like wizard school sort of thing. It just feels familiar, but I think it's a great idea. I'm not saying that it's not good. It absolutely is. It just may not be, it's not like weird, different fantasy. It's just very good fantasy.
Yeah.
A very good premise that fits the mold of what people definitely want to read. So yeah, my suggestion would probably be tackle this as a book first. And this could easily be like 100 books long. Like this is the sort of premise that you can just repeat forever. The kids never need to grow up. You don't even need to explain why they don't grow up, really.
Well, no, exactly. Or, you just get more kids in.
That works too. Yep, for sure. But nice job with this. Yeah, so just specificity and focus, especially in terms of the antagonist and the obstacles, that will help you delineate, is this a status quo versus a premise show, and where is that unifying element, the thing that brings everyone together and is sort of either a threat that we all must deal with, or is this just going to be every week there is a different threat that we must help or deal with in some way?
Yeah. Cool.
Thanks for sharing. Great idea. All right, we have 5 minutes left for last questions or log lines. Questions on anything we've talked about today?
No, I'm good, but it's nice. Thank you for the class.
Okay, thank you, Megan. Yeah, I guess there's no questions, so we can just wrap up.
It's been really helpful, even for me that's currently working on a fantasy book or supernatural, but it's been helpful with the magic and what have you. So
Great, glad to hear that. Thank you for coming, everybody. So as a preview for things coming up later today, we have a table read at 2 p.m. We also have a bunch of groups meeting today, so check your events tab if you want to see everything coming up. But we have we have poetry right after this. At 5 and 6, we have short story and fantasy groups. So fantasy fans, if you want even more you can't get enough, then come by at 5 or 6. And I forget which one is which. It's either 5 is short story and 6 is fantasy, or the other way around. But check those out. And we also have our WordCamp class going. If you're writing novels, especially fantasy novels, our upcoming boot camp, or our boot camp, which just started 2 days ago, will take you all the way from your completed outline to finished draft of your novel in 90 days. So that one's wrapping up in January, starting now NaNoWriMo National Novel Writing Month. So we hope that you guys will join us for those. Those next couple classes are free, and that's on WordCamp, which is Saturdays from 12 to 2 p.m. on our WordCamp server. And we also have Feature Bootcamp still going. There's a couple classes left, Friday 6 to 8. Once that concludes, it will switch to the Sunday slot, and they will swap. So Sunday will become features, and Friday will become TV. Okay, that's all we're doing for today. Thank you so much for coming by, guys. Hope you got some good info from this class, and we'll see you in the next one.